what we're saying when we say 1.5 is dead is we're saying, islands are gone, people's homes are destroyed, people are going to die. So I think we should, be very cautious about saying that until it's absolutely unavoidable.
Rupert Read, co-director of the Climate Majority Project, professor emeritus of philosophy at East Anglia, as author of many books, including the very cheery title titled "This Civilization is Finished." Thank you for coming back on Wicked Problems.
It's great to be back, Richard.
And I understand you have a bone to pick with me for the episode we put out a couple of days ago, which had some content around, amongst other things, the piece in the Telegraph, where Jim Skea was characterized as saying that 1.5 was toast. So have at me. Unload.
Well, it's yes. I don't really have a big bone to pick with you as such, Richard.
Oh,
I
go
just
on.
I got name checked in the piece, and I guess I've got some bones to pick with the person you had on from Climate Home News and some of the other people that you quoted hourly during the piece.
So, indeed, so I mean, so yeah, so poor Joe Lowe, he doesn't know this is coming, but like this is our first one of these. I would consider this our right of reply. So, but yes, we did name check you. That is absolutely true because I just to set the scene. So, and I think it was my fault. I mean, I suppose if Joe Lowe walked into something, it was because I set him up for it, saying that I noted that when the Telegraph piece hit on X and on Blue Sky and some other places, that people like David Wallace Wells just kind of he quote tweeted that and put it out there saying like, whoa, the head of the IPCC is saying that this has now been breached. I think I characterized as the first line of defense in the Paris Agreement. And then I saw that you had also then, quote tweeted from David Wallace Wells. And it kind of went from there. So it really went viral, this piece in the Telegraph. So, but tell me, did we get it wrong? Did you not mean to quote tweet it, or what happened there?
Well, we could talk about what's actually in the piece. So some
Hmm.
people took refuge in the fact that if you read the piece, and of course, I hadn't actually read the piece when I retweeted it because the Telegraph has a paywall, right? So I took it on good faith, retweeted it, and only got to read the piece a day or so later. Some people took a lot of comfort in the fact that if you read the piece closely, Skea doesn't, literally say the words that are in the headline. And of course, one knows that this is fairly standard bad journalistic practice to G up the headline a little bit more than is justified by the content. But there was something in the piece when I finally did get to read it, Richard, that did strike me very, very strongly. And I want to quote it to you now, which is what Jim Skea actually does say directly in the piece about 1.5. And what he says is that 1.5 is slipping away.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think that is an incredibly striking phrase. When do we use the phrase slipping away? By far the most common usage in the English language of that phrase is when someone is dying.
Right.
So I think what he's trying to do here is to break it, a little bit gently to people who are understandably very reluctant to come to this difficult conclusion that 1.5 is either dead or dying. And if you're dying, then you're nearly dead, right? That is what dying sadly means. So I would urge anyone who says, oh, no, the headline's wrong. Skea doesn't think that. And of course, Skea hasn't actually written a letter to the editor or published a separate op-ed saying, oh, no, the Telegraph got it all wrong.
Mm-hmm.
The wording he did use strongly suggests that he believes something not very far away from what is in the headline. And to me, that is absolutely no surprise whatsoever. And can I give you a bit of evidence as to why it's no surprise
Well,
to me?
can we come back to that? Because I mean, for
Yeah.
me, like, I think that's where I want to kind of like I want to come back to this because it's so important, and I want to like trade some rank punditry, but also as like ex comms guy, somebody who can like kind of kind of read the tea leaves in terms of like what we've seen since then. But I want to come back to, but like make your point very quickly before I want to come back to like some of the reactions you're talking about, some of the which we could say are understandable, which is very generous, but I think there's something entrenched, which I think is probably the more important point, which is that this reluctance to talk about this and
Yeah.
why Skea may be acting the way he is. But I don't mean to cut you off, Rupert. Please tell me what your main point is.
No, it's all good. So one of the things that Joe Lowe said on your program was that people have been, quote, very quick to give up on 1.5.
Hmm.
And I must say, when I heard that, I practically choked on my coffee. We've taken years and years. I mean, I, like many people, went through years of pain before deciding to come out and say, you know what, it's time to actually own up to a significant degree of failure here. And in terms of being very quick, also one could just say more directly, it's 2024. Arguably, this has been clear for some considerable time. The piece of evidence I wanted to adduce to you is that 2 years ago, I gave a talk at my university, the University of East Anglia, to the entire climate community there in camera. And the burden of the talk was, look, we should really tell the truth more on climate. We should admit that 1.5 is gone. This was before the insane temperature rises of the last 18 months, which have just made it so strikingly obvious. This was before then, right? This is 2022. So I gave this talk, and there were about 60 of us, almost the entire research community or very representative sample thereof at the University of East Anglia on climate, world-leading climate centre, of course. And the chair of the session did a smart thing, said, let's just take an anonymous straw poll in this room, here and now, in this group of people. Who in this room, who among these climate experts thinks honestly that 1.5 is still alive? Not that we're going to make it, not that we're actually going to stay below 1.5, but that 1.5 is still alive. I thought this is going to be very interesting. I've got an optimistic feeling that I might just win this vote. But what happened actually shocked me. Not a single person in the room said they thought it was alive. Not one.
Wow.
And that was in 2022. This is the kind of reality that's going on behind closed doors. And again, Joe Lowe sort of almost admitted this at one point when he said that he said, what is accurate is not always helpful, which is by way of standing awfully close to the wind of saying we should lie to people. We should pretend that the situation isn't as bad as it actually is. When you ask climate scientists directly what they actually think, what they actually fear, and especially if they're allowed to answer anonymously, it's absolutely overwhelming.
Yeah.
And
So,
that's awful, but that's how it is.
But I think you've put your finger on the nub of it, right? Which is that I want to give all generosity and assumptions with good faith to someone like Joe Lowe, who I don't think is a cynical opportunist who has some agenda where he's incentivized to be able to say these things in some sort of material way. No one's paying him to say we should be instrumental in how we talk and think about this stuff. Nor Sophie Vipon from the Climate Change Committee when she had a similar reaction, or indeed Mark Campanella from Carbon Tracker, on the panel where we quoted, all of whom you could just tell there's this visceral, I don't want to acknowledge this, or I don't want to be the first to acknowledge this. And so for me, that's what made the reactions to the Jim Skea Telegraph piece so interesting, was that people like David Wallace Wells seemed, like myself, primed for someone who is in a position of authority, quote unquote, to be first publicly, to call time, to fire the flare gun, to say yeah, actually, it's it's not going to happen, guys. So we should stop pretending it's going to happen. But I think people seem to be genuinely, and I think without, again, I think for perhaps, again, being generous, for the best of motives, however perhaps badly thought out they are, that if I consent to this, the consequences, I don't know what they're going to be, but they're going to be bad. And is my job really to be the person who helps to create this self-fulfilling prophecy that if this stuff is going to happen, I don't want to be responsible for helping to make it happen. So
yes.
am I
I think there's a
confusion
that some of these folks are vulnerable to here. They're like, if I consent to this, then the consequences are going to be bad. So here's two different kinds of consequences. The consequences of passing 1.5 degrees are going to be very, very bad. That is fact, right? So Joe Lowe said, look, we shouldn't allow that 1.5 is gone, because if 1.5 is gone, that means islands are gone, people's homes are destroyed, people are going to die. Yeah, that's the truth. These islands are gone. They're not gone because of people like you or me or anyone else consenting to it. They're gone because of chronic inaction by the world, grossly insufficient action over a very long period of time. And the other kind of consequences that we ought to assess is, what are the consequences of admitting that 1.5 is gone? Now, here's where I really am dismayed and somewhat troubled by the failure of a lot of people now to really think through that question, which we've had some time to think through. And folks like me have been for some time suggesting, actually, you know what? Maybe if we framed this right, and if we had the right kind of materials around it in terms of, well, something like the Climate Majority Project to help people to gain agency, to process the difficult truth, to gain collective awareness about the possible kinds of response. If we had all of that, maybe the consequences of admitting that 1.5 are gone could be good, right? That is the crucial potential narrative shift. Let me give a very concrete example of how the consequence of admitting 1.5 is gone could be good. As long as we hold on to saying that 1.5 is still alive, as long as we continue to pretend that it's still 5 minutes to midnight, we are never going to take adaptation sufficiently seriously, because we're always going to be thinking, oh, we can still stay below 1.5 degrees, right? Once we admit that 1.5 is gone, then we can finally step into the place of taking adaptation seriously. This is exactly what underprivileged people in this country and around the world need. If one is serious about climate justice, people are thinking, oh, if I care about climate justice, I must hold on to 1.5 degrees forever. No. If you care about climate justice, you will be courageous enough to admit that 1.5 is gone, and that means that we cannot now stop any longer taking adaptation seriously, taking loss and damage seriously, moving to help those who are grievously threatened by the actual situation that we are in as we move out of the safe zone. Because remember that's what 1.5 degrees represents. You know, most people on the street don't have any understanding of what it means in technical detail. But what it is reasonably easy for most people to start to grasp is 1.5 is what we were promised in the aftermath of the Paris Agreement, especially with the 2018 1.5 degree report from the IPCC. We were promised, oh yeah, look, we really do have to stay below this. The fact that that promise has been broken, the fact that we are moving out of the safe zone, the fact that we are in the age of consequences, this is exactly what we need to acknowledge if we are going to change the story. And that is exactly what we need to do.
And so, for me, like again, I've been on a bit of a journey, if I can say that without it sounding completely naff, for the last year and a bit, where, and again, we've talked a little bit less in private, like some projects I've been involved with where 1.5 was kind of bandied about, and like suddenly then no longer taken particularly seriously. We can talk more about that some other time in private, but some specifics I can't get into them publicly. But basically,
Yeah,
for
I've
me,
had
it's like,
similar experiences.
Bam. It's like, like your experience in East Anglia is basically like, oh God, no one actually thinks this is good. No one who knows what they're talking about thinks this is real.
Yeah,
And
the emperor really doesn't have any clothes except, pretend ones in public.
and the idea that, but this is the thing, what the constraints are. I mean, I asked a question, I probably shouldn't mention this because I probably won't be invited back, but I was invited. I was, asked a question at a press conference, for the Copernicus folks, putting out some data. And I just asked straight up, like, do you not think it's time to step out of your role of just saying, here's the observations about what's happening? And like, 1.5, you're clearly showing the whole point of this press conference we're doing is that you've got 12 months plus of actual contiguous 12 months of data saying we're above 1.5. Why are we pretending this is still something that is achievable? Do we not owe it to the people in Tuvalu or Kiribati or wherever to give them
Yes,
the maximum amount of time to
to prepare.
prepare for what is
Yes,
coming? Because we have a
yes,
moral imperative for that. And
yes.
the answer was, I mean, again, deeply unsatisfying to me. Of like, well, standard is we have to wait 10 years. I'm like, well, if you're waiting 10 years, how is that helpful for somebody who just has to decide like whether they're going to stay where they are?
Yes, and also, Richard, you're probably aware of this important research done by Richard Betts et al., which says, look, if we were thinking, when do we pass 1.5, it isn't actually good enough to simply do it on the basis of historical evidence. If we have a trend line going forward into the future, if we know that, for example, we're not literally going to stop burning fossil fuels tonight, right? You actually, if you're going to try to assess when does one pass 1.5, it ought to be done as a kind of average of a from a time in the past to the same period into the future. Now, of course, in some technical sense, that can't be literally done, but you can come up with pretty good approximations of it. And on any approximation of it, the trend lines are extremely clear. The amount of time it's going to take us to conceivably get down to so-called net zero, it's going to take long enough that this rupturing of 1.5 that has happened in real time over the last 18 months, this is not going away. Now, let's mention one more thing here, which is also that we should be clear, firstly, that if we're talking about actually staying below 1.5 degrees, as opposed to overshooting and then allegedly coming back again, although I say allegedly very advisedly, that this is, everybody knows that this is gone. And secondly, we should also note that, of course, temperature is not the be-all and end-all. There is one conceivable way in which something really dramatic could be done around keeping the temperature from going up too much, which is a very sudden program of stratospheric aerosol injection. And some people might respond to thinking, oh my God, we must stay below 1.5, therefore, by thinking we must do SAI, we must do SRM. That seems to me a really terrible inference, because if what we thought was that, yes, we could stay below 1.5 degrees, but we would have a massive acceleration in ocean acidification, because there would be years and years in which we would be like, oh, it's basically okay, we're below 1.5 degrees, so we can carry on. A world which was below 1.5 degrees and had horrendous levels of ocean acidification, to the level, for example, that the levels of oxygen in the atmosphere started dropping because of massive die-off of the plankton, etc., would obviously be a disastrous world. So, there's a fallacy of misplaced concreteness among those who say we must stake everything on staying below 1.5 degrees.
And I think for me, that is basically like, we were going to do a series on SRM, and I started that process the last couple of days, having some interviews with some folks that will be coming out with some episodes soon, because I do think that this has been the trigger for, you're seeing this more and more in The Economist, the FT, lots of other tier ones. I imagine you're going to hear about quite a lot COP29, and it's definitely because Pascal Lamy and others are definitely going to push this, for COP30 in Menem in Brazil, where they're going to explicitly try to put this on the agenda, like what's governance going to be around SRM. So let's come back to that, because that's a whole other thing, right? But in terms of like the counter arguments, so just take them, if you wouldn't mind, so do a little rapid fire. You're like several dozen IQ points above me in terms of being able to like do this. So I trust that you're the guy to do this. But in terms of like what we're talking about, the counter arguments of like why we shouldn't be abandoning 1.5 as we are at the moment. Okay, so first one, Rupert, is, so if we've invested all of this time, all of this effort into putting 1.5, the psychological impact of the entire establishment abandoning 1.5 as a goal will have to have unpredictable consequences, and therefore we should avoid it for as long as possible, which is like the thing I get the vibe from everybody I heard last week and we put on the show. What's your objection? What's your counter argument?
Yeah, so the key point there, I think, or the key term you used there, was psychological impact. And in that sense, this worry is, in a certain particular regard, quite correct. There will be a big psychological impact from giving up on 1.5 degrees, from accepting that we have no alternative but to give up on it, to let it go. And that is exactly what we need. We need a psychological impact. Do people really think that carrying on as we are? I mean, what is the theory of change for people who think that we're going to magically stay below 1.5 degrees? That is exactly what we need. We need the psychological impact of accepting this horrible fact, which, as I say it, I'm feeling it in my body here, this horrible fact that we have failed. And we need to be clear that acknowledgement of failure can sometimes be immensely powerful. One tiny example, I gave this talk in 2018 called "This Civilization is Finished." And it went more viral than any full-length talk I've ever given before or since. Why? Well, I believe that part of the reason why is that I started out by saying that politicians have failed the young people in the audience, the lecturers at Cambridge University. Politicians have failed the young people in the audience. Teachers have failed them. Parents have failed them. And that I've failed them. That everyone has failed them, and that I'm complicit in this failure because we've failed to protect them and keep them safe against what's coming. And that achieved enormous resonance for someone to be willing to step up and say, I'm implicated in this failure. Part of the reason, let's be honest, part of the reason people don't want to let go of 1.5 degrees, the climate establishment particularly, is they don't want to admit that they have failed. But if and when they have the courage to actually
Mhm.
do that, that's when we will get the psychological impact. That's when we will get the resonance, which is exactly what we need. And then we'll actually be together.
And I think that's an outcome that I think is one potential result of that psychological impact. Another that people cite consistently, whether it's Greta Thunberg, and no one's asked her recently, as far as I'm aware, but she has in the past been on record saying that giving up on 1.5 could result in a downward spiral of fatalism. You could point to James Fletcher during the Paris talks, representing a lot of small island states. It's a red line item. If we walk, basically, if there's no reference to it, that's why they were going to walk away from the Paris Agreement unless it was put in.
Mm,
So some question about whether that was ever really serious. And the idea that essentially that there could be, I think we talked about this in the green room, this outbreak of even greater levels of doomerism.
mm,
Michael E. Mann talks about this very frequently. And so the idea that perhaps, again, being generous, that the reason people are super, super reluctant to get there is because if they see that the consequence is going to be that it simply opens the field for other people to exploit a sense of despair, a sense of doomerism, a sense of fatalism that they can use for other means,
mm.
politically, economically,
Yeah.
that, again, that there's a higher duty to avoid saying the thing for as long as possible. So your
Yeah,
response.
and of course I understand that, and of course there is real risk here. There are now no risk-free. What I would say is this: the key point in relation to who is feeling this and how they are feeling it is that I suspect that a lot of the people who are holding on tight to 1.5 degrees are feeling this sense of brittleness and fragility themselves.
Hmm.
And okay, great, but why don't you get some help on dealing with those feelings of fragility? And I mean that quite literally and seriously. It's one of the things we strongly believe in the Climate Majority Project. We need to do inner work here. It needs to be shared inner work. It needs to be processing. And we need to find courage and resilience together. We need to have the courage in the first instance to admit our our despair, our depression, our grief, our anger, all of these difficult emotions that arise when we confront the reality. Now, what about the ordinary citizenry out there? Are they as brittle? Of course, some people among the ordinary citizens are going to be grasping for any excuse to give up so they can say, oh, so we might as well party and so on and so forth. But actually, there's some really good research done by our collaborator in the Climate Majority Project, People Get Real. People Get Real did a proper poll with Opinium several months ago now. And what this poll suggested is that actually there's a lot of resilience out there among the population, a lot of expectation that there is more bad news coming on climate, a lot of desire to hear that bad news if the bad news is true. And people were even willing to say that they don't necessarily have to be given grounds for optimism if those grounds for optimism are not there, etc. I mean, the analogy we like to use here is with the Second World War, right? The crucial step for Britain in holding on at the most difficult moment in the Second World War was Churchill not coming out and saying everything's going to be fine. We'll hold the Maginot Line. Everything's going to be great. Don't worry about it, etc. No, Churchill came forward and said, I've got nothing to offer you but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. He said it's going to be really, really hard. We're going to have to knuckle down together. This needs a full population mobilization. That's the kind of thing we need to channel, right? The climate Churchills of our age will not maintain a false optimism about things and about lines in the sand that cannot be held onto. And they will, when bad events occurred, and of course, Churchill had to weather many, many difficult, terrible events in the next year or two. They will not pretend that those things didn't happen. They will say, we need to find ways of this toughening our resolve further, but not our resolve to achieve things that are impossible, right? Saying now that we are going to hold on to 1.5 degrees is like saying we're going to hold the Maginot Line when the Germans have already crossed 300 miles into France.
Well, that's definitely, I think you've done the headline for the episode, essentially, Rupert, there, which is 1.5 is the Maginot Line. Guess what? So
Yeah.
let's quickly, I know I kept you up for time. So, like, two last things. One is I could go through the rest of the counter arguments. We don't have time, but I want to come back to a couple of key things. One is in terms of, like, again, just going back to the wanting to give people the benefit of the doubt. And again, you're a philosopher and a teacher of philosophy and a writer about philosophy. again, somebody who did philosophy as an undergrad. So, the noble lie in Plato, and Plato's cave and all that good stuff in terms of the
Mm.
Republic. Is there a little bit of kind of thinking where people are basically trying to protect, if they think of themselves as being kind of some sort of elite, and they're trying to protect,
Yes,
the hoi polloi, the unwashed, about
absolutely.
like, and so like I don't want to feel bad. I don't want to judge them too harshly for that, given we're seeing right now. I mean, there's FEMA in North Carolina has had to pull people out because
Mm.
militias are walking around with machine guns, threatening federal employees, trying to help people who are victims of the flooding from Hurricane Helene in northeast North Carolina, Western North Carolina. So this is like, it's not real, right? There are real world consequences of a lot of things that just get out of the lab, get out of control in terms of disinformation that bad actors are going to use. And so that
Absolutely.
they're really afraid that if we don't stick with this thing that we know is not true, then some of these really, really bad outcomes can happen. So just
Mhm.
thoughts of like, what's your advice as a philosopher for someone who is like thinking, I'm trying to do the right thing here, but maybe I feel not too great about it. Like, what's your advice how they get past that?
So I think one part of the advice, as I said a minute ago, is do shared inner work. Confront your fears. Say what you think to be the truth, at least in private, and then see if you can't take that into public. But going beyond that, yes, I think that there is a kind of noble lie stratagem, to be honest, which is going on still in quite a lot of the climate establishment. I think it is seriously misplaced. I think if we look at what's happened successfully in the last several years in the climate space, the most striking examples are in 2019, the launch of Extinction Rebellion and David Attenborough's Climate Change, the Facts, and Greta Thunberg and the worldwide school climate strikes. And what all of those have in common is that they sought to tell the truth and to emotionally resonate on the basis of it. And you can see that even more powerfully in David Attenborough in Breaking Boundaries and in My Life on This Planet on Netflix. That is the spirit which I would urge people to seek to step into. This is also what the great Simon Sharp has argued in 5 Times Faster, that this is exactly what we need. And I would say that this new stratagem of a narrative shift to taking seriously truthfulness across the board, across the climate establishment and way beyond, that is what we need. And if it is accompanied by that shared inner work, if people are given meaningful collective paths to agency like they were in the Second World War, if people are given a sense of, there's more and more people who are thinking like you, rather than some people being led to believe that they are weirdos for being as afraid as they are, and being told, no, it's not that bad, stay hopeful, stay positive, etc. If those things were to change in the way I've just tried to describe, then we really might be able to get somewhere.
Last question, rank punditry time. So, okay, so you and I both noticed that after this piece came out, and again, I don't want to impute anything other than the best of motives to Jonathan Leake, who's been on the show and who's a writer for the Telegraph, who was the byline on that piece. I think there's plenty of cover in terms of the editorial process of other people, actors who might have had a hand, act or part in deciding how to steer that. But I think if I'm okay, so I'm a ex whatever comms guy who's like over the last 30 years, been in and out of doing some pretty Machiavellian shit, Rupert, in terms of like advising people about like how to present themselves, how to make arguments, and then how to manage media. Right. And so I'm looking at this going like, okay, so Jim Skea has does this interview or whatever, the sidelines, it goes out, right? There's this big splash, big mach, big beasts like you and David Wallace Wells and others, like retweet that goes viral. Like people see this. Many people see this. It's been 8 days. I can find no evidence whatsoever. You mentioned a letter to the editor. Like there are far more subtle ways that if you were in Jim Skea's comms operation at the IPCC, you could let it be known that you thought this piece went too far in overclaiming. And
Mm,
so I wonder, is there a deeper kind of project here? Because Jim Skea is not an idiot. Jim
mm,
Skea is not new at dealing with media. Is there a case where he meant this to be the effect? He meant for people to hear that in the way that they initially heard it from the headline. And it's a trial balloon to start to soften the ground to get to that place that you advocate that we should be getting to. And he's trying to see, like, is this a way of like trying to, chart a path about how we get there?
Yeah, I think that's entirely possible. I don't know Jim Skea from Adam, but what I do know is that there are good people in the IPCC and the CCC and everywhere else who are trying to ease the path. And when I have conversations with very senior people in the civil service or in politics or in the Environment Agency, etc., the vibe I often get from them is, I want to be able to be more forthright and truthful. It's just institutionally difficult or difficult for my career or what have you. I would urge all such people to go as far as possible. And yeah, I think it's possible that Skea is going as far as he thinks he can right now. I come back to where I started. He uses this phrase, 1.5 is slipping away from us. Precisely the phrase one uses in relation to someone who is dying. There is a tragic death that is ongoing here. We need to acknowledge it, and we need to be blunt, to milk the full power from it. It would be a terrible mistake if people were to start to say, oh, well, maybe 1.5 is dead. Okay, then we'll just go to 2, right? That is not what we need to do. What we need to do is actually take in and acknowledge the full horror of 1.5 going. That needs to be a big piece of collective work. When we do that grief work together, then we will be able to be potentially in touch with an enormous power and energy, which can actually gear us up for the absolute fight of our lives, which is coming and which will really begin, I believe, once we acknowledge that the first phase, if you will, of the climate struggle of our times has failed.
Rupert Read, co-director of the Climate Majority Project, you've been very generous with your time. Thank you for coming back on Wicked Problems.
Thanks, Richard, for having me back on.
Jerry is a little bit late tonight. The dusk is deepening. Soon the nightly battle of London will be on. This has been a quiet day for us, but it won't be a quiet night. Searchlights are in position, the guns are ready, the People's Army of Volunteers is ready. They are the ones who are really fighting this war. Brokers, clerks, peddlers, merchants by day, they are heroes by night.
Thanks for listening to Wicked Problems, made possible through the generosity of people like you. If you liked this conversation, please share it and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps people find the show. If you'd like an ad-free version of this podcast, consider becoming a paid subscriber at wickedproblems.earth. You'll also get our newsletter, all our show notes, member-only goodies, and you'll be supporting media that wants to tell the stories at the frontier of climate tech, the place where people and politics, technology and capital meet and shape the future. And whether it's one you'd want to live in. Wicked Problems is written and edited by Richard Delavan. Production assistance was provided by me, Theodore Delavan. Wicked Problems, Climate Tech Conversations, is a production of Wicked Problems Limited. Thanks again for listening.
The night from her hair and take stock of the damage done. The sign of a great fighter in the ring is, can he get up from the floor after being knocked down? London does this every morning. There is no panic, no fear, no despair in London town. London can take it.